Okay, good evening. It is Thursday, April 10th, 2025 at 6 p.m. We are at the District Service Center in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. We would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the land of the Mdewakanton Dakota people. Mdewakanton means dwellers of the Spirit Lake. Our first item on the agenda is 1.0 roll call. Dana?
It'll be Sean tonight. Louise Hines.
Yes.
Ryan Clark.
Here.
Sharon Van Leer.
Here.
Eric Tesmer. Melinda Doles. Simi Petnag.
Here.
And Katie Schwartz.
Here. Okay, on to our next item, 10 point, I'm just skipping the whole meeting. 2.0, Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. Okay, 3.0, approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve? Second. Motion by Sharon, seconded by Simi. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Okay, on to 4.0, and that is our workshop items. We do have two this evening. 4.1 is Teaching and Learning Report on Science, and that will be introduced by Kelly Jansen, Assistant Superintendent.
All right, thank you very much. I'm excited to introduce our Teaching and Learning Services Department here to do this science report. As you recall, in December, we report on our annual Comprehensive Achievement and Civic Readiness Goals. And with that comes talking about strategies and other student data that we use to achieve those goals. And so tonight we're going to provide an in-depth look at our K-12 science. And this is the final of our teaching and learning reports for the year. And we anticipate a similar cadence next year of a literacy report in the fall, a math report in the winter, and then a science report in, I think we could say it's spring, right? In spring. So with that, I will turn it over to our teaching and learning department.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everybody. We have an agenda here that we hope really gives you a comprehensive look at science at K-12 in our school district. We're going to start by looking at the state standards and what we call our CIRC process and where we're at in that process. We're going to look at student data, student achievement data, and then we're really going to look at the curriculum sequence that students progress through and look through the eyes of students. So we'll have some videos in an elementary class setting and also a secondary class setting. So we're excited to be here. Before we start, I'd like to thank both Ian Bronson and Laura Larson and my colleague Arthur Williams, and also the communications department for their work in collaborating on this presentation. They did a lot of work, so really proud of this team.
Good evening, everyone. On this slide, you can see an example of the process that we go through when going through our CIRC cycle, and CIRC is the Standards and Instruction Review Cycle. Since we're talking about science, you can see the science rollout through the year 2030, and this is based on the current MDE Standards Review Cycle, and we use this to really have a thoughtful implementation of our science resources. Laura and Ian will get into detail about this, but on this next slide, you'll see that our new science standards are based on 3 dimensions. Dimension 1 being science and engineering practices, Dimension 2, cross-cutting concepts, and Dimension 3, disciplinary core ideas. Here's an example of what standards look like for grades K through 8. They are by grade level. So on the top, you can see this is an example of a 5th grade standard. For grades 9 through 12, you can see they are bundled together. So the example you see is 9th through 12th grade Earth and Space Science.
Okay, thanks, Arthur. So with some experience of doing some board reports and workshop meetings like this, we thought we'll start with the data first. So there are 3 areas that we're going to report on for a student performance perspective, and it's what we would call satellite data, right? It's high-level snapshots of our student performance. We know that our teachers are gathering and assessing and grading at the classroom level and understand progress at the classroom level, but this is really bigger picture data. So we're going to start with our MCA data.
As you saw on the previous slide, MCA science, the MCA is taken in 5th 8th grade, and then at some point during high school. On the left-hand side, you can see SoWashCo schools, our MCA Science. You can see for the 23-24 school year, we had a proficiency rate of 41.7, and then that's broken down, you can see, from elementary, middle school, and high school. On the right-hand side of the slide, you will see where we compare to state for elementary, middle school, and high school. And then this shows our participation rate for our system of students participating in the MCA Science.
So as we navigate then to our pre-ACT, taken in 10th grade, just maybe a pause on what does the pre-ACT offer us for data. First of all, we know that there's a lot of research to support just the experience of our students taking a standardized test. Whether it's the time, the formatting, the level of questions, it's really important that they get an opportunity to do that before the ACT. It's also very predictive. There's high correlation between what students score in the pre-ACT and what they will eventually score in the ACT, and it also provides us really valuable information to guide instruction and how to support students between the pre-ACT and the ACT when we're trying to make them college ready and hitting that benchmark. So as we look at this data, the science benchmark score for college readiness is 20. In 24-25, we had 41.1% of our students hitting that benchmark. It certainly is trending in the right direction from 23-24. You might ask, what does the benchmark being college ready mean? How does College Board define that? Students that are 20 or above can apply scientific reasoning, interpret data, and understand scientific concepts. The other piece that I should mention about the importance of pre-ACT is we know that test anxiety is a very real thing. So for students having another opportunity to be able to be in that environment before even a higher stakes assessment like ACT, that's very important to give that to them. In terms of participation rates, we have the last 5 years, 83%, as I always go to the right of the graph, 83% of our students took the pre-ACT. Moving on to 11th grade, the range of 11th grade is, ACT is a 1 to 36. The pre-ACT, I should have mentioned, is 1 to 35. That's the range for a top score. 5 years of data here, we were at 43% of our students that received or that met the benchmark of 23. There has been some conversation at the College Board, you might have heard, of making the science component optional. We as a district have said it's really important for us to maintain the science component of our ACT because we have such few, so few data points as is between MCA and pre-ACT and ACT that we think it's really important that we keep that in there for the student experience, but also to guide our own instruction and our own continual improvement. And then the final slide that we have here is a little bit about how we rank against the state in terms of meeting the benchmark. And you can see that generally we are trending just above the state in terms of that type of performance for our students. We do really look forward to using the pre-ACT and the ACT data in even more transformative ways. So for example, how do we use it in our professional learning communities? How can it get into that classroom level? Is there an opportunity to use our pre-ACT data to support students in an ACT academy? So actually using those results in a meaningful way to prepare our students to see increases towards that college readiness benchmark.
All right, now on to the fun stuff of looking at science through the eyes of our students. And to do that, we have our two TLS supervisors. It is my honor to introduce Laura Larson, who serves as the TLS supervisor for elementary.
Thanks, Arthur. Good evening, everyone. I feel like I have the fun part here. I get to show you a little bit about what's going on in our elementary classrooms. So we have this kind of broken in two parts for you. So we're going to see you've got two handouts in front of you. You want to be on the elementary science side. There's a double-sided. You'll see secondary and elementary. So if you look to that elementary side, you'll notice some language about anchor phenomenon, which gives you a nice definition of what we're talking about. So our elementary students really experience this launch with an anchor phenomenon, which I won't read it to you, but it is basically something that's occurring in our natural world that we can use our science knowledge to sort of investigate or explain. And so the example you see on your screen here is from matter to organisms. This is a short video usually, or an image that students see projected on the screen. It's a hook usually. It's pretty exciting. This one's about food webs. And those guiding questions that you see on the right-hand side of the video are what our teachers are using to kind of have students think about and discuss what they already know. Our students come to us with so much curiosity and so much worldwide knowledge that they bring in a lot of that content either. So it's just sort of hooking them in with that anchor phenomenon, and that sort of launches us into our science experiments. So if you, on the next slide here, you're gonna get a little snapshot, just about 3 minutes of what our elementary classrooms actually look like in action. So you'll see on your handout, there's some boxes that if you like to check boxes as you're looking along here, those science and engineering practices are visible throughout the videos for you to kind of follow along. No need to check boxes, but it's there for you if you like to check them.
So talk at your table. Why do you think that we would use rocks?
I think maybe so that the water, when it comes down, it doesn't just stay only at the roots and overfill, so that it can go to the bottom and start the water cycle.
Right, we don't want to drown the plants, right? The seeds, we don't want to drown them. Good.
What do you like about science?
Welcome to my stream. The experiments.
I think the rocks will act as the accumulation.
I love how you use the science term we learned yesterday. Let's give them all a whoosh. Ready? Whoosh! All right.
This experiment's kind of fun, huh? It is fun.
I say seeds, you say water, seeds,
Water.
seeds, and then stop. Okay, how many seeds do you put in the dirt? One. Why are we already put some in water, why are we putting?
So in that quick snapshot, you can see sort of two different classrooms across our district within the same unit at different stages. We've got one kind of coming to that hands-on, building that mini ecosystem to wrap up all that they've learned throughout the science unit, and then the other just in the initial stages of testing out what do seeds actually need. So our elementary students experience the units you can see on the screen up above. We, at the elementary level, we cycle through all the areas of science, and it spirals through all different grade levels, so kindergarten through 5th grade. Unlike our high school courses where it is one course, elementary they get to experience all of those science areas across the year. You can head to the next slide, there we go. So the example you saw today was from 5th grade. It's that second unit from matter to organisms. And so just different stages of what's going on in the classroom. What I love to see is the hands-on component. Kids are actually not only reading and writing about science, but they have their hands in the dirt and they've got their hands on seeds and they're making observations, and it's super engaged, you could tell from the video. Right. So switching over to our elementary staff, what this looks like for our teachers is really starting with those benchmarks that our state standards call out. So the example on the screen for you shows which benchmark is being addressed by both of these classrooms to get at that bigger learning of those guiding questions and honestly going back to that anchor phenomenon on what do plants and animals need in order to live. Every unit starts with a storyline at the elementary level. This helps teachers to help guide students through a story or a process. And so each storyline launches for not only teachers, but also to guide our students. So that's our example of our unit storyline for what ecosystems really need. Your second handout really breaks down that flow chart you see on the left-hand side. This is where our teachers really do start. Go back to that. There we go. Perfect. If we go back to that handout, this is a really quick at a glance, just a flow chart of what that unit is going to look like across the entire unit. So looking at what is that anchor phenomenon, what are the concepts that we are addressing within the learning, and then also previewing and coming back to that unit project so students not only see what it is that they're working toward, but then they have an opportunity to build that hands-on learning as well. And then again, by the end of the unit, having students checking in, are they able to answer those guiding questions that have been guiding them throughout the entire unit? And then usually there is a project with a final piece, which for this one was that mini ecosystem. One final piece that our teachers also have available to them as they plan are looking at those same science and engineering practices that you have on your handout. So it really guides them in showing which lessons and which topics are being covered within science and engineering practices, those disciplinary core ideas, and then which cross-cutting concepts are being addressed within the various concepts that they're learning. So the example you saw today was from Concept 1, really focusing in on those plant needs. I think next up is our secondary example.
All right, well, good evening. I'm really excited. We're also we're really looking at that, and then know that the standards actually are sort of fit underneath each of those substrands. And then remember, as Laura mentioned, in elementary, they cycle through each sort of core concept of earth and space science, life science, and physical science, which is inclusive of physics and chemistry when we get to that high school level, every single year. And then once we hit middle school, we then focus on just the earth and space science in one entire year. And so you'll see that, look at a video that shows 6th grade. I'll have a 7th grade teacher talk to us, and then we'll have 8th grade as well, and then we have a snippet of 9th grade as well. So we'll jump in right now. So while we set it up, feel free to jump in on your sheet.
All right, so one thing that's been working really well in 7th grade across the district is we decided to do all of our common assessments in the form of CER, which is claim evidence reasoning. And I was just talking about how it's really applicable to any unit that we do, any essential question. The students make a claim about it, they back it up with evidence from all the labs or activities that we did, and then they show reasoning to tie it all together. And it's really applicable to like science in general, but also specifically we target standards as a group of 7th grade, and we all are doing a CER. That's kind of our common assessment for each unit. Bam!
So I say it's the opposites of each other because the winter solstice means that there is less sunlight, and the summer equinox has more sunlight. on the bottom and it's not angled towards the top.
And it's like hitting the
The
tropical
Capricorn
Capricorn.
is below the equator.
So that means the southern is having summer right now and the top is having winter.
So this is basically what's
You're stating your claim, what you think causes seasons. Yesterday I changed this to hypothesis. By the way, yours says claim, this one says hypothesis. So if your hypothesis was supported, that is your claim. If it wasn't supported, come up with a claim that supports your evidence. Or your
Seasons change because of the Earth's axis is tilted. First, the side of Earth that is faces away from the sun gets the least amount of sunlight. When the Earth rotates, the sun hits different spots.
kinetic energy is like
When it's moving.
yeah, the movement, and then potential is when it has the possibility.
Yeah.
We're just saying like what station we're on, what object it is, and the forms of energy that it is, and the energy transformations that we're observing about it.
Okay, go ahead. So like when she pulls it back, that's potential energy, and kinetic energy is passing through as the balls like hit back and forth.
We chose to create sand dunes, and this relates to our unit because right now we're talking about landforms and how they formed, and ours is mostly depositional, which is winds moving the sand grains around, forming the dunes.
All right. Well, thanks for watching. Hopefully you caught some of the phenomena in there. Hello. I'm struggling a little today. Bear with me. Hopefully you caught some of the phenomena in there and the topics. I get a kick out of watching the energy of the students and their engagement. One of the new really pushes for our new science standards is using narrative, defending based on evidence that you see in a phenomenon or a topic or a research that you're doing, and then articulating that to your peers or to the class. And hopefully you saw that multiple times, developmentally appropriate as we continue through the grades. And so it's fun to see in our elementary level, the students are writing and they're saying like, hey, what do we notice about what we're observing? And you see that all the way through to our ninth graders in this case, and we see it all the way through all of our high school courses as well. So it's really fun to see the students engage in that dialogue and try to explain what's happening. So hopefully you caught it, right? It's about the summer and winter solstice. If you're paying close attention, I've had the opportunity to watch this several times. But what's fun is their thinking was revised as they went through that class. And it was really neat to see those students struggle with what is the solstice, how does that relate to seasons, and then they revise. Just know, my little notes on the bottom there are just for your own. We're not going to walk through each one of them, but that's the science behind what's going on. So we'll move on to life science. And really, Mr. Olafson gave a great articulation, a description of what claim evidence reasoning is. And so our teachers, it's really been neat to see our teachers across the district come back and say, how do we teach each particular phenomenon based on this claim evidence reasoning? And then, of course, they start to sneak in that word of hypothesis, which some of us who are in science recognize that word as well. So that really is what that claim is, and then how do you test that claim? So moving on to 8th grade, we looked at a roller coaster investigation. Hard to see there, and we didn't see it on the video, but they do have the mathematical principles up of what is kinetic energy and what is potential energy. So 1/2 the mass times velocity squared is kinetic energy, and so those students are actually processing with that as well, getting out their calculators and calculating that based on how high their marble starts. Really a fun opportunity for those students to practice multiple times to see they were tasked with, can their marble do a couple loop-de-loops in that, and then also land safely in a cup without pushing the cup off the table. So some complexity there in making students revise that science engineering practice of we try something and then do it over. All right, and then finally 9th grade, they're looking at a national park presentation, and they use that as a springboard to say how are certain things formed on our planet. And so we observe sand dunes. That was what the girls were talking about in that particular project. How did those form? They form through deposition, and so they have to investigate that and then be able to articulate. They present that to their peers, and they have a choice of doing it as a poster or a presentation or a talk to their peers. Again, using that narrative approach of how do we explain the science that we're seeing. All right, we'll jump to the next one. Oops. Oh, I mixed up my slides over here. No worries. So I just put in there, these are the 8 substrands that we have, and like where do you see those as we walk through those videos. So I just jotted in there like which grades you would have seen those in there. So asking questions and defining problems, hopefully you saw that. Planning and carrying out investigations. They were able to analyze the data that they got in class and then make a difference. Somehow it slid off a little bit on that one, but maybe it's on the next slide. We'll try it. We'll just skip past it, that's all right. So this is where we go back to, once we jump into 6th grade, students are in earth and space science. We utilize discovery education as sort of our core resource. And really what the teachers do, these are each of the phenomena that Discovery Ed has for us. But no, like for example, when they were looking at weather and the seasons, that really comes from the superstorm and dog sled racing. Both of those talk about the different seasons, then they use that as a springboard to talk about how do seasons work on the planet. And then that final one would have been looking at the rocket sled, because they're looking at energy and how that works. And so they'll use that rocket sled as a springboard, and then they can talk about kinetic and potential energy. Then when we get to high school, the traditional pathway as we start now with earth and space science, that was introduced a couple years ago. Most students then move to biology, and then the traditional path is they go into chemistry, and that's their physical science. Students actually have the option of taking physical science for chemistry or in physics, but the traditional pathway is just going into chemistry. And then if we go to the next slide, really a lot of our high school students have a lot of options as they move through high school. And so you can see here different options. No, this isn't supposed to be all the potential ways students go through high school. So some students will take AP Bio their junior year or maybe even their senior year, but these are possible pathways to which they can go through. You'll notice the color there, our IB program at Park. They sort of do a 1-2 punch when they do biology. So they'll do IB1, then IB2, same thing with chemistry. And then the AP classes usually stand alone. And know that AP Physics 1, AP Physics 2, not all students do that. Some will take just AP Physics. And then AP Environmental Science is offered at our online school as well. All right, that wraps up our sort of sneak peek at science. If you guys have any questions, any of us would be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
I have some questions. So I guess we can just go kind of in reverse order. So Ian, have we seen, like, you mentioned that in secondary we're using this narrative focus for students as they are understanding science. Have we seen a difference in comprehension, or maybe not in our district, but maybe do we know what that having a narrative focus does for students' ability to comprehend the material?
Yeah, I mean, we're jumping with the MCAs this year, and that's part of why we back mapped to make sure we had our students in that. So we're really looking forward to that data this year. I can speak anecdotally to a lot of the teachers saying, hey, my 7th graders are grasping concepts faster because they practice this as 6th graders.
Oh, okay.
And so that's been a neat piece as I've worked with the science teachers as they recognize, hey, this is really working. And claim evidence reasoning is also used in English, and so the students are starting to get like, oh, this is a way we think about acquiring knowledge. And so anecdotally, we have it seen, and we're hoping that we'll see that those results on the MCA coming up.
Okay. And then in terms of, you know, I'm looking at sort of the high school pathway, right? And in terms of options that students have, you know, my kids took AP Chem, and there's only like 20 or 25 kids at the high school in any given year who take that class, right? So what do we do for students, or have we not figured this out yet, for students if they, with the addition of earth and space in 9th grade, it feels like they don't get to take pre-AP Chem or pre-Chem, whatever the class is called, before they take AP Chem. Do we have, is there a way to ensure that all students do have access to advanced content in all, biochem and physics at each of our high schools? Or will we run into kind of enrollment issues if they don't have enough years to get there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Can we go backwards one slide? Because it'll help us, I think. So just yesterday, I was actually meeting with the biology teachers, and there's a couple ways we address this. So one, really the answer to your question is yes for both. Some of our students will find a little bit of a squeeze, and they'll have to make a choice of what do I do my senior year? And so that's one challenge that they do have. The other is we're encouraging students, if they feel ready and prepared, they can jump into those AP classes instead of taking sort of what we would call like regular or core classes. And so our biology teachers yesterday were having a discussion of, I think they had, and I apologize, I could look up the exact number for you, but it's about 20 students that went from Earth and Space Science directly to AP Bio.
Okay.
And one of our teachers was expressing, of those students, she said over half are actually really helping set the bar each test. Like they are really engaged and doing incredibly well in that class. So then I have some others that they're working really hard, and so I'm helping them along, and they're successfully navigating that class, but they're recognizing it's really a tough class.
Okay.
So that's an option for them, and then they can jump right to AP Chem. Most of them do honors chem first, and so it just changes their pathway a little bit.
And so actually that brings up another point. So when we were talking about the data and not all of our high schoolers are proficient, and I know that the MCA you take in high school is for bio, right? And so if you've got these kids who are moving straight from Earth and Space to AP Bio, if you take AP Bio, you're not taking the MCAs, but if they are setting the bar in AP Bio, are our bio MCAs then artificially depressed because we've got this group of kids who are not, who should be taking that class but are not taking that class, and therefore we have fewer proficient kids because a lot of the proficient kids are not eligible for the test?
Yep, great question. With the MCAs, you always take MCA reading as a 10th grader. When you are in biology, whatever biology you take in high school, you take the MCA. And so even if a student takes the AP Bio, they take MCA.
Okay.
They take the MCA as well, so hopefully those students are there. So they would still be counted
Okay.
as part of our cohort of kids who take the biology test. Even if a kid takes AP Bio their senior year, they are enrolled in biology, they would sit for the MCA.
Okay. Is that new, or, because both my kids took AP Bio and neither took the MCA that year that they took AP Bio, and so but they both took regular bio.
Yeah, and that's what happens if you take regular bio already, you're tested then, and then you don't have to retest when you take bio again.
Okay.
But if it's your first time through biology,
Then
then
you
we
take
would
it.
have them test.
Okay. And then, okay, well, Melinda has a question, and so I don't want to ask any questions she might have. I'll come back, because I have plenty more.
You probably have this one too. So I just have a question. So you showed us the MCA opt-outs and you gave us an idea of like what the participation rates were, but I'm wondering if we can get a better idea of like the population of the opt-outs.
Yeah, we can certainly, sorry, thank you. We can certainly bring back that information. We would need to study it a little bit, but we could probably come back with that.
I did.
Would that be of interest?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to see like if it's a certain group of kids who's always opting out of the MCAs, and if they're, I think I don't want to speak for Melinda, but I think what Melinda's probably interested in also is, are the kids who are opting out kids who are likely to be proficient, or kids who are likely to be not proficient, or some combination thereof, or is it totally random or whatever, right? But just kind of to get a better understanding of what our scores would look like with or without when these kids are added back into the cohort, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I think we're looking currently at ways to be a little bit more innovative to make sure that those participation rates increase by embedding opportunities to take the MCA during the day. So that should help. I also anticipated that same sort of question around the pre-ACT and who's not taking the pre-ACT, because there's 17% there, and I anticipated that question and that we'd have to come back with who is a part of that 17%, and we can get you that information.
Yeah, that actually was one of my other
Was it?
questions,
Okay.
especially because I know for the pre-ACT, a lot of those 10th graders who are opting out are choosing to take the PSAT
Yes,
instead.
yes.
And so if you're taking the PSAT, it's usually because you're trying to get a head start on like the national merit stuff. And so are those kids different from, is there some difference in who is opting out versus not opting out, I guess?
We can study that. That would be great.
And then with the MCA scores and the ACT, can we see, or do we know what are the areas where students aren't proficient, right? Because if there's 40 or 50% who are proficient and 40 or 50% who are not, and I know that there's a bunch of like subtopics within each of those. So do we know, are there certain subtopics where kids are more likely to be proficient or less likely to be proficient? Do we know?
Again, we can look up those substrands and
Yeah.
we can report it all at the same time. That
You
would be
guys are just,
helpful.
it is really unfortunate that I have a high school junior who's going to take the ACT on April 22nd, and so we have been talking about the ACT
Yes,
a lot at
right.
home, and so I'm very sorry for all of my,
I think as Ian mentioned too, though, the new MCAs are this year. So we wouldn't have any of that strand data for the new standard MCA is going to be this year. So we can certainly pull strand data from previous years. You know, the MCAs do give us quite a bit of information when we dive into them and look at our kiddos. So we can look that up.
and then for the standards that the MCA, or the standards that the state set, do they also set the benchmark too, or is the benchmark our interpretation of how we're going to teach to the standard? Like the benchmark that was on the slide?
Yeah, the benchmark language is the state's language.
Is the state's language, okay.
Yes.
Okay. That was it. Those are my last one was what is driving the proficiency score, but if that's part of what we'll be getting at the data this year.
I just have a clarifying question, Mark. You had mentioned that the MCAs are going to be offered during the day. Aren't they already taken during the school day?
We have specific testing days at the high school, if you recall, on the calendar. So I believe it's the Wednesday before the admin break where we do some of the testing. And some students are asynchronous learning. And so we're having some conversations about participation rates since we've gone to that model versus having it like the morning of a day and then they go into other classes. Logistically, those are difficult when you have a 2,000 student high school to figure out. But the administrators kind of brought it forward like, gosh, our participation rates have gone down since we've had this special testing day. So let's talk about what can we do different. So
when we do the ACT, then do we get higher participation because it's on a Tuesday, or like it's just on a regular school day, or is it the same sort of stuff as we see with the MCAs?
I think my assumption is I think our participation rate's a little higher because I think it's a higher stakes test. I think it means more for kids. I think they know what they use it for. It's an opportunity to take a test that normally they would have to pay for. But I don't know that to be fact, that it is higher, but that's what I would assume, that's why that participation rate is higher. And that is one that is really difficult with the parameters around the testing requirements, like 5 feet away and all of the things that we have to do. That would be really difficult to have every kid in school because we need so many rooms for our kids who are testing. But that Wednesday before break is when we do our pre-ACT, our MCA, science, or reading, so those are the ones we're talking about.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I got one. So for the MCA data that indicates proficient versus not proficient, for each individual student, what is the score or percentage or whatever that they're required to obtain, I guess, in the area of science to be considered proficient?
Kind of like when Mark mentioned, like 23 was the threshold for ACT, and usually it's that 50. So if it's a fifth grader, the score would be 550. Is kind of that meets. There's kids that waver on other side of that are partially meets and partially does not meet, but the score of 50. Now, to translate that to 50%, I don't think is an accurate. Like to say it's 50%, but the score is 550, and it just depends on the MCA in terms of what that actually means of how many it's correct.
So it's not really based on, I guess just to make it simple, if there's 100 questions, do they have to get 70 of them right? Or we don't really know, or?
Yeah, we don't really know that, right? Like the MCA, like the Department of Ed has this scoring that happens behind the scenes, and so it's not as simple as saying 70%-ish. We do know, like, and it's by sections as well, and so then all the sections are, put together to kind of make that composite like ACT, so there could be a section that they do, not great on, but then they do really well on another section, and those even out, so.
Okay. Is that been pretty consistent throughout
With MCA scoring?
several decades, or is that changed, or do we?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the MCA scoring has stayed pretty consistent since MCAs have come out. MCAs have evolved, and I think AI is going to play a role in terms of evaluating students' work as well. So we may see more free-handed MCA. We used to have an MCA writing, and we don't have that anymore. So, but I think it stayed pretty consistent.
So the formatting maybe of the test, well, the formatting of the test has changed, no doubt. The scoring, though, system seems to be somewhat consistent or fairly consistent.
And that's what I would offer without, evidence. But I would say that the questions now, when we say a new MCA is coming, the questions in the MCA are related to the new state standards that were required to be implemented this year. Yep.
I think, Eric, one thing that we always look to is there's that score of if you're a third grader and you take it, it's 350, a fourth grader's 450, a fifth grader's 550, as Kelly said. One thing we'd look at, because there's that definitive line of marking a student then proficient or not proficient, what schools tend to take a look at is who are those students that were within kind of striking distance of, maybe they were a 449 or 448, and then what are those skills that we need to move students up into the proficient. But in reviewing MCA data, in the past, what I've seen is there are a number of students who are within that plus or minus 5 of hitting that proficiency mark, but they cut it off right at that 50 number, not percentage, but the 50, 450, 550, et cetera.
Something to add that may or may not be helpful. I've had an opportunity to sit on some of the MDE panels, and in the math area, not in the science area. However, in the math area, a fifth grade MCA will also include sixth grade questions. So there are questions that exist that are to show growth, and does not necessarily impact that meets or does not meet. Another thing that happens, again, math question, if there is a question and it asks something to the effect of which figures have an area greater than 64, kiddos have to read that S, meaning there may or may not be more than one correct answer. If they don't select all the correct answers, select one, there's no credit for that at all. And so I think, if anything, at least what I've seen in math, if anything, those scores are probably a little lower than I would have given, some credit for understanding this particular figure has that in a classroom.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to 4.2, and that is our strategic plan update, and that will be presented by Julie Nielsen, Superintendent.
Thank you. It seems like just yesterday we were starting our strategic planning work, and when I look back at the timeline and the dates, it's been a number of years. If we could go ahead and get the slide deck up. I just wanted to begin by sharing just the outcomes for this presentation is just to review the history and where we were and where we are today, to review our strategic plan roadmap. I think it's important when we take a look at the roadmap just to remind the board that the roadmap, the mission, the vision, the core values, and the approval of the buckets, the mission, the vision, and the core values, all of that language was negotiated and conversated with our board. And if you remember, we took a couple of Saturdays to have those conversations, and then the board approved our final roadmap. We will take time tonight to have the leaders in the various bucket areas review the work in those areas, and then we'll talk a little bit about the measurements and what our community and what our board can expect to see in terms of the measurements that we'll be using. So the next slide is just our timeline. The winter or fall of 2022, we gathered a team, I want to say almost 100. This boardroom was completely filled to begin the process. As you recall, it was a classroom to boardroom process. So the board didn't take action or get involved until kind of the very ending, and it was the last couple of months. You'll see we worked on that through the winter and spring of 2023, and then it was May 18th, almost 2 years ago, that the board approved that strategic roadmap, mission, vision, core values, and our strategic buckets. Since that time, we've been working on creating our vision card and how we're going to communicate the data, as well as setting up project plans with our various departments and how we're going to roll our big work out into the system. The next slide is really just a visual. I think we're going the wrong, I'm going to go to this. Sean? Is it? Sean? I just want you to know I'm not Dan, so please don't cut me off. Don't just keep going ahead to the slides. To point out this, because this is our communications department's work, thank you, Sean. And this just is that one pager, the mission, the vision, core values. People around the table know that I always say 2 I's, 2 E's, and a C. It is just the quickest little acronym to remember are 2 I's, 2 E's, and a C. So integrity, innovation. Yes, I know we had a long conversation, board members, about educational innovation. We didn't want to be 3M. I think that was our conversation. 2 E's, equity and excellence, and connections. And so those definitions, if you recall, along with mission, vision, those were all negotiated with the board. That really was the final act of the board and not executive cabinet. So our next slide just gives the visual. And I want to just point out on this particular slide that light blue at the top and the light blue at the bottom. All of our work is sandwiched in between what our students, staff, and families said they wanted out of South Washington County schools. And we call those our desired daily experiences. And so we'll reference that throughout our presentation. You'll also see that the strategic areas, student experience, mastery of learning and expectations, et cetera, all have an assignment of one of our executive directors and cabinet members. So just to recall, these are the sheets, and if you look closely, and I know we don't have those printed out, but you can see what our students want, what our staff want, and what our families want. So at the end, we want to make sure that we have measurements to measure those desired daily experiences. So our mission and vision, I hear it referenced a lot, educating students for success. That's just the quick short. And then our vision, leading by example, working together with students, staff, families, and community to support each other. Our vision we don't talk about as much, but certainly when we sit down and have our meetings, we certainly know where we're headed into the future. But that mission of educating students for success is always forefront. So our buckets, again, you're going to hear tonight about the work and the strategies done in student experience, mastery of learning and expectations, our student pathways, and really just to point out as our individuals present, those first 3 buckets are really interchangeable. When we talk about the work and what we've done, we're like, it should be in that bucket, it should be in this bucket. So just to understand, there's really a flow through between the student experience, mastery of learning, and their pathways. Operations, staffing, and finance is a little bit different and more delineated, and then engagement and partnerships, again, really kind of more separate, but able to be woven into the other buckets. And this slide just shows at the very top the individual executive cabinet member or leader who is responsible for the work in those bucket areas. So to start us off, and we will just go around and we won't do any pauses just for the sake of time, Kelly will start us off with student experience, and then we'll just have our directors continue on.
All right. Thank you, Julie. I'm excited to share the strategic direction that underscores our unwavering commitment to the student experience. Through this direction, we will create systems that promote positive student interactions, amplify student voice, accept students for who they are, and welcome all students as part of our community. You might see this familiar language in our district tagline of be seen, be heard, and be bold. To bring this vision to life, we've identified 3 key areas of focus. First, we've empowered our schools to take ownership of their school improvement plan by giving them a SIP template that supports them through the creation of their very own theory of action. And I put that in quotes because I would probably say it's theory of action light for researchers out there. But it's schools going through that process of, if we do this, then we hope to see this. And they're using data on both sides of that to measure it. This allows each of them with the template given to them, this allows each of them to set those intentional goals directly tied to enhancing their student experience and to implement tailored strategies for their specific communities. The second strategy, amplifying student voices, and you've all met many of them, is established through our active student ambassador groups within each school and the district level. This ensures that student perspectives are not only heard, but actively shape some of the key decisions that we make throughout the district and fostering a true sense of partnership with them. That is one of the goals that we talk about in the student ambassador group, and that's one of the measures at the end of how much did you feel we accomplished this. So we definitely survey our students on the outcomes of our student ambassador groups as well. And then finally, the student handbook isn't new, but we've reprioritized a clarity and understanding by ensuring that all students are thoroughly educated on their rights and responsibilities as outlined in that handbook. It empowers them to navigate their educational journey with confidence and a clear understanding of what we expect of them and what they expect from their peers. So some of the specific work that we have accomplished within these three key strategies, within the SIP plans, as we review those, some of the theories of action that address that area, for example, is the implementation of conscious discipline school-wide, the establishment of consistent and supportive morning routines, so having a routine every time the students come through the classroom, the integration of monthly themes into learning and school culture, and then some targeted professional development and responsive teaching strategies, meeting kids where they are so that we can teach them those academic and social skills that we want them to have. So you can see by the varied approaches that each school created these theories of action that allowing them to do that. This is one of those areas that Dr. Brookins, Ms. Schaefer, and myself were really passionate that a principal and their team need to establish their school climate and culture. This isn't something that we will all say you all have to do something around here. So it's been pretty successful and we're excited to see where that goes. The second strategy of student voices through student ambassador groups, some of the things that our student ambassador groups have been involved with, invaluable feedback on school themes and rebranding efforts. I know that the CGMS student ambassadors were huge in rebranding their logo this year, so that was fun to see. The development of district and school-wide climate and culture initiatives through posters and videos. The Woodbury Elementary Student Ambassador Group does their weekly news, and it's so cute to watch those kids do their video about what's happening at Woodbury Elementary in the news. So that's been fun. And then they are often our first group that we do pilots with our student surveys. Like, does this question make sense? Does that question make sense? What do you hear when you hear this question? And then, of course, you've heard about it, that they get to participate in that nutrition services tasting, which actually ends up with what our students are seeing in their cafeterias. So those student ambassadors are definitely a way that we've ensured that we have active partners within our students, and our schools have found them to be really valuable as well. And then the last bucket of work is just that clear understanding. To accomplish it in the elementary schools, we had just conversations with teachers, age appropriate. It wasn't a deep dive into the handbook as it was at our middle schools and high schools. And so for our secondary schools, though, we did utilize Schoology, and we had every student go through a course in their advisory along with discussions. Some of the things that we made sure that they were aware of, some of the changes, for example, the Title IX legislation that changed, we made sure students were aware of that. Our bullying policy and prevention, we made sure that they understood what we expected with that. And then, of course, the changes with the cell phone usage were an emphasis this year. So making sure our students are safe and informed and know what we expect from them. So we're really proud of the work we've done, and I've really been proud of all of these strategic directions because the language that the board has provided really allows us to hone in on some specific strategies, so it's been really helpful. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brookins.
Thank you, Kelly. And that brings us to the next strategic direction of mastery of learning and expectations, and it kind of dovetails that student experience. So now we have our students grounded, we've heard from our students, they feel good about what they're going to bring to the table. Now it's about, okay, what are we teaching? And we want to be clear about what we're teaching and how we're assessing what we're teaching. And then we also, you see language around personalizing learning experiences. Each student will be on a different path. And so when you think about a large high school, just as we saw with that science teaching and learning update, I might be on a path where I'm going to take an AP class, or I might be on a path where I'm not taking that AP class. We want to make sure that we have opportunities for our students to have access to learning experiences that will support the path that they're on individually. We go to the next slide. So the strategies that we have put in place to accomplish that is identifying where the access points are for every student that's coming into our system and the particular path that they desire to be on, to make sure that they have those essential skills to be successful on that path that they're on, along with the knowledge that's going to come through the standards that we are teaching. And then we have to make sure that they are positioned to be successful at that next grade level. And we do that what we call at the core instructional level. And so that at that core instructional level, that's where everybody's going to be exposed to that standard. And then from there, they will have an opportunity to grow and that knowledge in that particular area. Now, we also recognize that as everybody has exposure to that state standard, there will be some opportunities where they're going to need additional time to fill any gaps. And then we'll also have an opportunity to, some students who are going to need some acceleration opportunities around that particular standard area. And so we want to make sure, as we go back to that term personalized learning, to make sure that each student gets what they need. The second point here says personalized learning by empowering students with a wide selection of career and college level courses. When we look at that secondary experience for our students, we want to make sure they have a pathway that's going to set them up for the future, and they have some decision-making into that particular pathway. Now, the work that we have completed around this area is we've established what we call a multi-tiered system of supports. You will hear the language MTSS from this point forward. And with MTSS, it's a framework that guarantees that every child will have access to curriculum, opportunities to receive acceleration or to fill those gaps at different points in their, I would say, educational journey. And so this year we have successfully trained leaders around the MTSS framework, and also we've started to train staff on what that framework would look like. And that framework encompasses kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And so you can walk into every school at every level, and they're going to be able to point to their MTSS framework and talk about what actions that teachers are making to make sure that students are learning and they have what they need to be successful. That particular framework will also have an opportunity to not only provide that core instruction, but when we get to, you'll hear us talk about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Tier 1 will be the core instruction. Tier 2 would be, okay, what does Tyrone need either to be accelerated or to fill some gaps? And then what resources are going to be put in place to make sure that he has what he needs. With that particular model, you will see a pyramid that's inverted, and it'll say what school teams do, and then what do individual teams do. And so it's very articulated and specific, very easy to follow. It will guide the work that our PLCs, which are professional learning teams and communities, focus in on, and then they will use assessments to guide that reteaching and guide that original teaching around what our students need. And then a final piece that we completed this year is what we call the profile of a graduate, and that has been finalized. Every student that we have educated for success coming out of South Washington County schools should be resilient. They should have effective communication skills. They should be able to critically think and critique information that's in front of them so that they are socially conscious. And those components make up what we call being a lifelong learner, and that profile of a graduate articulates that. And so with that, I will pass it on to Christine Schaefer and Aaron Davenport as they talk about student pathways.
All right, thank you, Tyrone. And so now that we've talked about the student experience and mastery of learning, we're going to move to the third bucket of student pathways. And so that is really what opportunities do we have for students, what pathways and supports do we have to meet each student's academic and social emotional needs. And so our strategies for that are providing a strong literacy foundation for all students, and that included, as you remember, training for all teachers, teaching staff in literacy, and you've approved that calendar, and we've added all those PD days, and so that's been happening all year long. And also evaluating our special services delivery system to ensure that all learners receive the support that they need. And so what we did this year, all teaching staff were trained in literacy, so early learning through elementary, participated in Carry IL, participated and are still participating in Carry IL, grade 6 through 12 plus, Online Language and Literacy Academy, and grade 6 through 12 plus specialist teachers, adolescent literacy solutions. So again, that's still continuing. It started at the beginning of the year and it will go through the end of the year to give teachers a strong literacy foundation to then transfer to students in the classroom. Erin?
Thank you. Excuse
We also partnered with Hanover Research, which is a global research and analytics firm, on a project that had to be slightly revised due to some nuances with our contract. And so what we landed on is partnering around what are other folks doing in our state with the same rules, the same accountability measures and systems, small, medium, and large, just to get a sense of what's working for other folks in addition to what we know is working for us. So we centralized that review around academic outcomes, social and emotional outcomes, preschool and early learning, all the way through transition. We also looked at graduation rate and discipline data, and this is all specific to students with special education. And then we looked at five national districts that are considered exemplar districts to just look at how do they do staffing, how do they look at caseloads, how do they talk about programming, and what could we consider to potentially bring into our district.
The next bucket is operations, staffing, and finance, and that is the bucket that Chris Blackburn and I work most closely in. The work in that bucket is all about investing in our employees while still being accountable for effective and efficient management of resources. And so some of the strategies in that bucket are maintaining and updating facilities to support safe learning environments for both our students and staff, sustainable and efficient staffing, also hiring the best talent that's out there, and then the efficient use of district resources to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability. Some of the work that we've done that you know about is construction. You know a lot about the work that's being done there between bond construction, lease levy, and also our LTFM projects. Also this year, we issued bus IDs to help track ridership for all of our buses and to help ensure student safety and tracking. And our technology team has also been very busy making sure that all of our employees are on multi-factor authentication. And you may be aware of that as board members, as you've had to go through that process as well, but that helps protect our systems from cybersecurity attacks. With the READ Act training that we were talking about before and the additional PD days in this calendar, we've used that opportunity to also invest in our non-licensed employees and provide more professional development for those groups on those professional development days for READ Act for licensed employees. One of our big undertakings this year was a project called True Time, and what that means is all hourly employees in the district who were paid even pay throughout the school year were transitioned to a real-time pay where you punch in and punch out at the beginning and the end of your shift. That's been one of our big pieces of work this year. And then, of course, our continuous budget improvement process is an important part of the work in this bucket as well that we worked on this year. Now I'll turn it over to Jake Winchell and Sean Hogendorf.
Thank you, Abby. Hello. Thank you, Abby. So I am working on engagement and partnerships, and I'm doing that with Dr. Cheryl Jogger. And we're working together to promote engagement and sharing of resources to build stronger family and community connections. So a lot of the ways that we've focused on doing that is just intentional outreach with a focus on improving our multilingual communications to help engage all of our families within their students' educations. So I've been working as well with Nikki Clymer on that, and she is our Director of Multilingual Learning. And then we've also been working to connect on with families to share important information through fun and engaging activities. That's a lot of things in Kids Club, that's community ed, that's a lot of the stuff that Dr. Cheryl Jogger does with Schoolie and things like that. And then the third part is to be doing the community outreach through strategic partnerships to connect needs and resources within our SoWashCo schools community. And that's a lot of the work that's also being done with SoWashCo Cares. And so some of the work that to show what that looks like is with multilingual support. So this year we've launched a new language line app, which gives 24/7 interpreting services for conferences, for family meetings. And so that is an app now that if families need that, they're able to choose the language that they can understand best and or their primary language. And then that would facilitate that right on a phone or a laptop. It's really kind of a neat program. We've also now have translated report cards, so those will all be done in Spanish and in English now. We've also worked on improving our multilingual enrollment process. Our website is also translated in 7 languages, so we've added Oromo and Amharic to that. And then the tools for families is a section that we think is tools for that families will use as they go through our school system. And so we've been adding to this as we learn different questions from families and how do we support them to be able to find how to use campus and how to check up on their students' report cards and things like that. And then the last part here with the multilingual supports was the New to Country support campaign. And again, that was led by Danilo and Nikki Clymer in our multilingual learning team. To just close out our multilingual supports. Family engagement, and a lot of this has been done through our district ambassadors and affinity group meetings. We have had three this year so far. We've had 2. We've had a third one coming up in May. And so those are the all district ambassadors, and then we meet with different advisories and affinity groups throughout the years. Monthly for most of them, but they all have different bylaws. And then we have the early childhood family education screenings. You've heard a lot about those from both Joyce Beard, I think, had spoken to that, and then I think we spoke to that in the last workshop as well. And then we have a lot of different cultural events and literacy events that are happening throughout the year as well. And then from a community engagement perspective, this is our second year that we've come back through the quarterly print newsletter. So we'll have one more of those that's going to come out in May, and that gets mailed to every family or every home in South Washington County Schools District. So this will be our second year of putting out a quarterly newsletter for that. Schoolie runs a ton of events over the summer, so that's starting to kind of come up, and we'll be kicking off here in the next couple of months. And then the community education program, volunteer opportunities, like the Growing the Read to Meek program, sorry about that. And then the new food rescue program, and then Generations Cafe are also different ways that we try to engage our community.
Thank you. Just to share with you that when we get together and have what we call an operational planning retreat, it's all of our departments together. And the one thing that we really have to work hard on is balancing what we're pushing out to the system. Because if we're all not aware what's going out, pretty soon we have 5 different resources or curriculums being implemented at the elementary level. And then we have bus passes. And so together we really try to make sure that we balance it out so that we can manage the workload and do a good job of implementation. I'm going to round out the presentation talking about our vision card and the data sources we use and how that's going to look. And so up on this slide, I'm not going to read it, but board members are aware of the various surveys, the different information we collect. Just to remind the board, that community survey we did was right as we were starting the referendum work. And so we are planning to commission another community survey in 2025, and that would be the November, December. And so some of the information you'll see on the vision card comes from that. I think to understand that that's pulled then every 3 years, so it allows us an opportunity to go back. On the next slide just shows the rubric. And the rubric really, Dr. Mautau Jacobson helped create all of this behind the scenes, and I know board members got to see what it looks like from the nitty-gritty of grade levels, of demographics, free and reduced lunch, many, many different categories. And what we came up with as a group was kind of the blue ribbonish. Like vision achieved was the brightest blue, down to yellow, you're making progress, red requires intervention. And so as an executive cabinet team and operational directors, and instructional directors, what we'll be doing is monitoring now as we move forward, what areas are requiring intervention and what are we doing? So as we measure on our vision card, we actually are going back now and measuring those desired daily experiences of our students, staff, and families that our community, that our students said were important. So in the left-hand column, you're going to see the experience. You'll see the data source of where that information is being pulled from, and then you're going to see the results. And then the final column just gives you that color coding of where we land on our rubric. And so we know, and this isn't new information, and we know we're going into a testing season. Even as we heard science percentages tonight, we know that those were from last year. We know that one of our biggest areas of focus is around our overall academic achievement in reading, math, and science. And so you can see those areas, according to the rubric, require intervention. And so we're going to really need to dig down deep. I know one of the board members talked about strand data. That's really what it's going to take as we move forward, to take a look at what specific areas are our students falling short. So this is just the example of the vision card for our desired daily experiences for students. On the next slide talks about staff, and what you see on that particular one, these were actual experiences they listed, and right now we don't have any survey that we conduct, our community survey, the Minnesota Student Survey is for students, so these particular questions would be asked on a district survey, a district staff survey. So once we have that information after May, we would update our vision card. We hope for the survey to go out in early May, and then we would be happy to update the board with what those percentages were and what the results showed. For families, you can see that right now there are 2 data sources in there. We've used the community survey for 2 of the experiences, and then you'll also see the Center 2, which were some of the desired daily experiences that families had wanted and asked for. Those we don't have that information anywhere, so that would be part of a district family survey. And what we're trying to coordinate is that if schools have any surveys as part of their school improvement plan, if they have any questions they want to ask their parents, that we can combine it so parents and families aren't getting multiple surveys from the school district and or the school. And then finally, the district. I wanted to point out as I talked with the board on Monday and as Chris and I talked that first one, yes, we overachieved. There should be like another color for overachieved. 17.2 unrestricted. Our policy was set at 16.6 by the end of 26. And I said we can smile today, but we also know how quickly that money goes. So fortunate that vision achieved there. You'll see the next 2 are the community survey, and that just takes a look at the experience in our district, district decisions, as well as school board and administration. You'll see where those are. And then the final one as a district, the graduation rate, and that is through the Minnesota Department of Education, and that is our 2023 cohort. So again, bringing the board and our community back to the work that we do, where we measure that out through our desired daily experiences of staff, students, and families. And then in terms of next steps, I was at, Gray Cloud Elementary School this week as they were preparing for MCA testing. There's a lot of work that goes into the next weeks with all of the kind of the culminating tests, especially our MCAs, reading, math, and science. And so a lot of work being done at the school level. We will be able to update at the end of the school year the data. A copy will be shared with the board and posted online for our community and families. And then we have a cadence with our district directors where we sit down and take a look at the work in our system and what are we pushing out, what's your timeline, when do you need to get in front of principals, when do you need to get in front of system leaders, because it's all a big communication sequence to make sure that as part of our work, we're always getting feedback or sharing information and then coming back to the full team. So a lot of work has gone into this, and so for our executive cabinet around the table, thank you. It really takes all of us to manage the work in a large district. And so with that, we will take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Julie. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Seeing none, we will move on. Thank you. Okay. We are on to 5.0 information items, and we do have 2 of those this evening. We'll start with 5.1, financial update. That will be presented by Chris Blackburn, Director of Business Services.
So I kind of feel like I should have intro music here because I see Simi smiling down there. So I am excited, though, to be here this evening and talk about special education funding. So I did tell Sean I would talk real quickly because I know that it's a lengthy agenda. I will share that there's a lot of information in these slides. It's pretty, I'll say, information dense, and so I'll be highlighting on some of the slides, but know the information is certainly there for you to review further. You can always reach out if you have questions. There really are 4 key takeaways that I would like you to come away with tonight. And that is, special education funding is complex. There's a lot of moving parts to it. I would like you to understand, number 2, various funding sources and some basics of the state special education specifically. 3, the significant financial impact that these funding sources have on our budget. And the final is really to just know that it's highly regulated and that it requires a lot of detailed reporting and reconciliation at the end of the year. So I think it's important to start just with a bit of background. And so with that, just to point out that we're required by law to provide the appropriate necessary services to these students with disabilities from both birth through child's 22nd birthday. It also it has to be based on an assessment of the child's educational needs. And so we have to develop a written, individualized educational plan for each of those students in response. Again, with the state and federal laws, because we know that federal comes into play as well. And we'll talk about IDEA later on. But we know that, again, that helps to that highly regulated nature of this funding sources. By the numbers, it's just helpful to kind of put that in context as well. And so statewide, this information is as of December 1st, 2023. That's the most recent available currently. And statewide, there was 165,285 students, or about 19.3%, that received some special education services. And locally in SoWashCo schools, we know that we had 3,865, or about 19.6%. What I'll share as well, we know statewide, I compared to the previous year, and it was about 18.4 was our local number. And so we know that we're continuing to see both statewide and locally some growth in the number of students qualifying for services. In the next slide, it's the funding. Notice the funding. There you go, Simi. Special education services are funded by the following primary three categories. We receive state special education aid is by far the single biggest funding source that we receive for these services. Federal special education aid, third-party billing revenue. So outside of those three, if there are remaining unfunded costs, we do have to fund those with general fund, whether that's state and local, whether levy, general basic education aid. And I will point out, though, that all students, we receive basic formula and general education aid for all students. So these students still generate that aid as well. And so again, it's appropriate that we utilize those funds for that. State special education aid then, like I said, this is our big bucket. It's provided really to offset the additional cost of the specialized instruction services provided to those students. The aid helps offset direct expenditures, and we have to make sure that they're necessary and essential to provide those services. The formula is multi-step hybrid formula, which sounds real fancy to say. It's very complex, and it's largely based on prior year expenditures. This slide then shows the 7 components of state special education aid, and they're listed below. The two I'll point out that we don't receive, and you'll notice that on the future slides, are hold harmless, and that's due to how we get funded currently, and then homeless transportation aid. And right now we just don't receive funding in those categories because we're not eligible to. Again, we could potentially in the future. The 7 components listed provide a single, or combine them to yield a single special education aid amount. So to bookend the data intense or information intense slides, I thought it was helpful just to illustrate what those 7 categories look like. So I took 23-24 actual revenues, looked at the state aid and said, here's how that shakes out. So initial aid, we received $22.5 million. Excess cost aid, and we're going to talk about each of these categories in the coming slides, $7.2 million. Special transportation aid was $12.3 million. Tuition billing adjustment was a negative 1.7. And so what that, we'll talk about how that comes to be, but that is a note that we did use our federal funds to offset that. That would have been 4.7 million without that. And that does reduce our aid. Hold harmless, as I said, is 0. Cross-subsidy reduction aid. You've heard us talk a lot about cross-subsidy over the years. We received 10.3 million last year. And the homeless transportation aid, again, another category we aren't eligible for. That gives us to that one big number of gross special education aid of $50.7 million last year. I'll point out the proration factor on here is at a 100, which means we received all the aid to which we are entitled and eligible to receive. And we'll talk about why that's important as we look to 25 at the end of the state SPED number. So on this slide, the first component was the initial aid, and we get the least of the 3 options. And so there's option 1, which is old formula expenditures, which is a fancy way to say salaries, contracted services, supplies, and equipment. There's option 2, non-federal, which adds in largely benefits, and option 3, census-based. I'm not going to give you a quiz on what those 3 options are, but what I would like you to know is that we generally receive under option 1, old formula. The second component is excess cost aid, and really it's a component, an additional aid to help offset that excess cost. So it's kind of self-described a little bit, but that's excess cost that's not reimbursed through regular special education aid. Some further information on the slide, but it is based on prior year data. So you'll notice that's a recurring theme as well. The third component is special transportation aid, and this is really transportation for the students that have an IEP, if they're in care and treatment, students who are homeless, and if they have a 504 accommodation plan, and that they require that special transportation. Again, prior year data, sense a theme. The fourth component is tuition billing adjustment. And so I will point out on this slide that this is really reflective of those students of ours who receive services in other districts. So think open enrolled students largely, but they go also when we send students to 916 for services, they're enrolled at that district. And so they bill us back for 80% of the services provided there. So for our resident students, if they're served elsewhere. Similarly, we also charge students. So if we have students from, say, Stillwater receiving services in our district, we also charge Stillwater. So we charge external districts if we're servicing their resident students as well. They net those two together, and then that strictly flows through Department of Education. Years ago, I'm old enough to remember when I used to audit, and we had to wait for tuition bills from districts. And so it got to be just challenging, right, to do those calculations. And so MD took that on since 2007. The fifth component is hold harmless. And really, what I would say, we don't receive this. And so I'm not going to, you can read the slides certainly, but again, because we receive that option 1 old formula aid, we're not eligible. This just makes sure that we don't receive less than. The sixth component is cross-subsidy reduction aid. So this is one that we frequently talk about, the cross-subsidy in special education, and that's the unfunded piece. So when we talked about needing to use general ed previously, that continues to be the case. They've just managed to shrink this number some. And so it's the amount of general ed aid that's used, or general dollars that are used to cover that unfunded costs. I will note that it increased to 44%, and that's been in place now for several years, and it's anticipated and still expected in statute to go to 50% beginning in 27. And again, it's based on the previous year information. The seventh and final component is homeless transportation aid, and again, I'll point out that it's described in detail, but that we don't receive that, largely because of how we're funded. So we're not currently eligible to receive this aid. So the bookend piece, funding for fiscal 25. So I took from 24-25 our estimated revenue based on revised budget. And so initial aid under option 1, we're receiving, anticipated to receive 27.3. Excess cost aid is currently at 11.2 million. Special transportation aid, 13.4 million. That tuition billing adjustment right now shows a minus 3.9 million, but that does not include the anticipated use of our federal funds. So we would anticipate that would, if we use 3 million again, similar to last year, we would see a minus 900,000 there. Hold harmless and that transportation aid again are at 0, but the cross subsidy reduction aid at 14.2 million. We add all those components up and we get that final number of 62.3 million. Proration factor, however, is 95%. And so right now, it happens at the state, they have a statewide cap. So they say every district in the state that's going to get special education aid, they know the total that they have set in statute that they can distribute out to districts. Right now, what they would distribute out is too high. They don't have enough in that cap. So it's prorated at 95% currently. So we're scheduled to receive 59.7 almost. We're anticipating, our understanding is they've never in history have had that not where they've raised the cap, but it will take legislative action. So the next funding source then, so that was all state special education aid. That's by far our biggest number in this category of funding. But the next funding source really is federal special education aid. Again, it's largely driven by the aid is provided under Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. You'll hear IDEA quite frequently. It really is, again, just to help offset some of those aids. I know we used to talk to, they originally were going to fund it at 20 or 40%, and we don't even get near that. They were going to just invest heavily in it, and we have not seen that. The fundings first comes through the state and Department of Education, Minnesota Department of Education, and then they allocate it out to us, largely in a 3-part formula with base amount, and then it's based on poverty and enrollment as well. On the next slide is really just differentiate. So within the umbrella of federal special education aid, there's 3 unique buckets. And the first is by far our biggest bucket, and that's for ages 3 through 21. It's the most broad category of what we can utilize in the ages we can utilize it with. And that's considered, Aaron will love me here, I'll say Part B, Section 611. We just call it FIN 419 in finance, but then the second category is for the ages 3 through 5, and we receive significantly smaller dollars in that category. And then our second biggest is actually the Part C, which is for servicing the students birth through age 2. So there's some specialized dollars for that. The last funding source tonight then with state special education is third-party billing revenue. And what I would really point out, it's required by law that we pursue these dollars. And where we get and most other districts get is really on the medical assistance, the MA funding. And it's for covered health-related services only. And again, it has to be indicated clearly in the child's IEP, which we talked about, the individual educational plan, or for the littlest kiddos, they call it an individualized family service plan before their school age. We can use it for any eligible SPED expenditure within the qualifying for third-party billing. There are a few nuances on what we can utilize it for. The next slide then shows, because sometimes, well, how do we generate those dollars? What is a health-related service? And here's the list of some examples of what is included in there. So physical therapy services, occupational therapy, speech language, mental health, nursing are some of the most common ones that we see. And we've managed to increase that revenue quite a lot in the past number of years through the great work of Erin McCoy and her team and the individuals in these categories that provide those services. It's a lot of documentation to receive that revenue. I like to have some illustrations, so they're not, little blinking or anything, but there is just a recap of those. So on the last two aids, then we talked state SPED, and that was that very large number. On the top of this slide is the federal special education aids, and again, those three categories. So you'll notice the most significant is that top number, that almost 3.9 million, real close year to year. You'll notice not a lot of fluctuation. In total, then we received just over 4 million in federal special education aid. We might have the question of, well, what happens if they go away, or the U.S. Department of Education, if they take those dollars away? It'll be challenging, because then we will have to take those costs on. And so again, back to that, what are our funding sources, right? If they're eligible for state special education aid, we could potentially leverage that. Third-party billing, we could look, could we leverage that? And I would say the likelihood is that it may come out of general fund as well, just undesignated dollars otherwise. Third-party billing revenue, I'll just point out, is about 2 million. And so that was a lot of great work on the special education student support services team last year to really get that revenue driven up above 2 million last year. And so we're anticipating to receive hopefully quite the same this year again. Final slide. I told Sean I'd talk fast. Expenditure reporting and reconciliation. So it really is what I wanted, because it's so highly regulated, that we have to report our revenues, not just in one way, but in two ways to the state. So the first is the finance side. We send off our data and information via, and we call it UFARS always, but it is delineated out, Uniform Financial and Reporting System. But that really gives our summary financial data to MDE, and then they utilize it for report cards so that we can compare across districts and such as well. Additionally, we have to provide detailed expenditure reporting in, we call it SEDRA, Special Education Data Reporting Application. I always get the A wrong. But it not only does it check for allowability, it checks to make sure that if we have a teacher here, and maybe Stillwater does, that we don't go over FT, or we're not, it has some parameters in what kind of cost, and sometimes we have to provide actual invoices to the state. And so it's a really detailed, a lot of lines and a lot of going through our financial data and that to reconcile the two together. But they utilize SEDRA to calculate the aids. So before November 30th of each year, we have to reconcile the two to the penny. I did look last year, and I would like to say that our team was very successful, and I'll give a lot of credit to Mary Beth Collins, who was brand new last year, and Nikki Castle worked to reconcile that $73 million across all the funding streams that we reconciled to the penny. So again, it makes sure that we get the aid we're entitled to, and that's why the importance of that. But the 4 takeaways again. The complexity of the funding, right? It really is a lot of nuances. I know I kind of really highlighted a lot of it, but there's a lot of complexity behind that. The various funding sources that we get, as well as those basics of those 7 components of state special education aid. The significant financial impact. Again, when we look at that $60 million in state SPED aid, that's about 20% of our revenue. That's a big number for us. And then it's highly regulated. And again, that year-end reconciliation to the penny, it just helps, again, to hopefully provide some, I'll say maybe some confidence, right, that our numbers and what we're doing is eligible cost, and that we're doing it with a lot of high degree of accuracy. So with that.
Thank you, Chris. Does anybody have any questions?
I do. First of all, Chris, I love this, and I really appreciate the deep dive into some of our finance buckets, just to help everyone understand and level set, like where we're spending our money and how our money comes in. And so thank you so much for putting this together. My first question, I guess, is for Erin. What is driving the special education growth? Like, I mean, I don't now.
Don't make me say the C word, Cindy.
I was going to say, but I mean, what, to have 20% of kids be enrolled in special education, and I don't remember that, and now, of course, I was like 10, right? But I don't remember this percentage from when I was a child. So do you know sort of generally how, like, what is driving this, and is this just something we're going to see in the foreseeable future, and is it going to continue to grow?
Well, I hope it doesn't continue to grow. I hope we start to level out. It's always reassuring to see that we're on par with the state, right? I would worry, I worry about that number too, but I would worry more if it was significantly different than what the state average is. I would offer that our assessment tools in the medical field and in the educational field only continue to grow. Our understanding of trauma, of mental health, of mid to long range impacts of those experiences and the effects, the long-standing effects, we understand more and more over time. Things that perhaps in the past we would reject as behavioral choices, for example, we now understand the factors that drive that in a different way. And so I think all of that together, and then broadly across our nation over the last decade, we've really grown in our understanding of autism. And so we see that as one of the greatest growing categories that we have. And then our early intervention, right? So we, more and more, we have doctors and community providers that recognize things early and get those referrals into us early, so we can start providing services earlier. And then I would also offer in celebration that our slight increase over the state average, I do believe reflects the caliber of the services we provide. And we often have families reaching out saying, we're moving to the state or we're moving to the area and we've heard you're the district to move to. Can we talk about what my student needs and what school would be best for them?
Okay. Thank you. And so sort of as like an adjunct to that, we get $2 million from billing MA, right? But if Medicare cuts happen federally, and I know Minnesota has the provider tax, right, which is a little bit unique compared to other states, but do we know what the impact of that could look like?
I would offer that worst case, that dollar amount would go away.
So that would go straight to zero.
And so,
Okay.
Hopefully that's not what we see as what we end up being at, but I would say the, like doom and gloom scenario would be that those dollars, both the federal special education and that tuition billing, third-party billing number go away. And so that would be, roughly a $6 million that we would have to consider how do we leverage that, and how do we services other creative ways too. We know that on the horizon period we have challenges, right? Whether it's with enrollment or with some of this too, and I think Erin and her team have been working really diligently to say how best can we service our students, right? Knowing that sometimes there can be a gap in expectations of maybe a parent might think their child needs this and what maybe services are really meeting that requirement of the federal and state law. And so we always are working to kind of balance that because we certainly want to provide that appropriate. But to that, potentially it would go away.
Okay. And then just a couple clarifying questions on the finances. So the special education transportation subsidy that we get, that's only if they're on a special education route, correct? Like if they're taking the regular bus,
correct.
There's no
That's
funding.
only in their IEP, and so typically they need specialized transportation. So
Okay.
maybe they need a Lyft bus or otherwise, right? So yes.
Okay. And then the other thing is that with the 24-25 fiscal funding, right? So I have seen in the news that, as things get cut at the federal level, for example, somebody will make a commitment to some expenditure and then the federal government has chosen, they've decided they're not going to reimburse, based on what the expectation was or whatever. So this is kind of our worst case scenario, but if we do get the $3 million from the federal government, then this would go up to $65 million, correct?
Correct.
And then we would get 95% of that, or would
No.
would that factor change?
So the what would change on that slide is that rather than, so how on the earlier slide it had 100%, so that factor would change to 100%.
Oh, it would?
So the proration would go to 100. Now I would qualify that a little bit. While certainly if they change that aid and raise the statewide cap, we would receive 100% and receive that 62.3 million. That said, one of the areas that they're looking at is the transportation aid, and one of the governor's proposals is to reduce that to 95%. And so it's kind of that shell game a little too into where, because we also know that the state is facing some challenges as well, and they need to balance their budget. So we continue to be optimistic a little, and while still trying to plan as best we can.
Okay. So worst case scenario for our budget is that we wouldn't get the $3 million from the federal government, and that the MAA dollars would also theoretically could also go away.
Yep, so it'd be about 6 million if both the federal and the third-party billing would go away.
Yep.
That said, too, on the state side, if they make some changes there, we budgeted conservatively, so we did budget that 95% proration because there just is uncertainty whether that for sure will get raised. And so certainly that 6 million, I would say staffing, as we've talked so many times, that's already set for next year. And so I think we'd likely have to take that 1 year hit, which again, the importance of building that fund balance so that we would maybe be able to navigate when there are times we can't quite adapt for maybe a year. And then we would really look closely at what does that look like? Is there a different service model we could have? What's driving some of those costs? And is there any way that we could maybe contain some of those a little better? But again, a lot of it is driven by, student need, but then even the staffing cost associated with that. So as we settle contracts, so again, back to that complexity, right, that they're all in play into those scenarios.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Okay, we will move on to 5.2, and that is the first reading of proposed policy changes, and that will be presented by Julie Nielsen, Superintendent.
Thank you. This evening, I am bringing forward 9 different policies that have been reviewed by our policy committee and now coming forward to the board. To start with, policy 407, employee right to know exposure to hazardous substance. I'm not sure how this word could not have been included in the policy, but it's the addition of the words bloodborne pathogen to section 2. 504, student dress and appearance, just a minor grammatical change on that policy. 507, corporal punishment and prone restraint. You'll probably see the most adjustments, and that is required by statute. 513, student promotion, retention, and program design. There was just a title change with the wording to make sure that the wording reflected the definitions within the policy. 517, student recruiting, no proposed changes there. 518, DNR, DNI orders, that's do not resuscitate, do not intubate orders, no proposed changes there. 521, student disability, non-discrimination, no proposed changes. 529, staff notification of violent behaviors by students, just some clarifying language updates in that one. And then finally, 532, use of peace officers and crisis teams to remove students with disabilities from school grounds. And that policy had no proposed changes.
Anyone have any questions or comments related to the policies?
I have a quick question. So for this 507, the corporal punishment, prone restraint. So if there's an incident at school, or there's kids being violent, or something that needs to be broken up by teachers, what options are available to people? Obviously, hitting them seems like you can't do that clearly, but how do you restrain somebody if you can't put them on the ground?
Yep.
Do we have like self-defense classes being taught to folks? People know how to do wrist locks, joint locks,
No.
pressure points?
No.
Kinsetsu waza,
No.
ose waza,
No.
anything at all? So it's just
I
wait
would
for the
say-
SROs to come essentially? Is that-
No, I think what we do, and Aaron, you could maybe help speak to that too. We have something in place, de-escalation strategies, crisis prevention, intervention. Is that correct, Aaron? Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we use the Crisis Prevention Institute model for nonviolent crisis intervention training. And so all of our special education staff are trained, and it has a variety of increasingly intensive interventions going from nonverbal to verbal, all the way up to physical when absolutely necessary. So to answer your question about training, yes, we do provide training, and there's lots of opportunities and options that don't include putting someone down on their chest face down.
Yeah, but my question is, if someone is really violent at school, what options do teachers or administrators or whoever have to deal with that in a safe manner that follows the state statute but doesn't put the student at risk or the teacher at risk? That's
Yeah, so we
ultimately
implement
my
the principles of that training model.
And that training model is?
A range of nonverbal to verbal to physical intervention that promotes safety.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Do we have any, no comment? So these will be brought forward for vote next board meeting. Okay, on to 6.0, and that is reports and comments. We will start with Superintendent Julie.
All right, we have had this last week has been busy. Just to highlight, this past week, we had Literacy University at, I have to think, Lake Middle School we were at. And just for our community to be aware, and as we watch information come out in our parent and family newsletter, it was just a wonderful event. We had the Newport Library, the Washington County Library, Red Balloon, Barnes & Noble. We had our early learning program. We had our adult basic ed program, and really just a great opportunity for resources. And while it wasn't well attended, the model itself was really strong about how do we work together and promote literacy. You know, I think as we take a look at the literacy crisis in the district and the performance of our students, we also know that we have to work with parents and families early, because so much of language is developed by age 3 into age 5. And so just a shout out to our teaching and learning team for great work with the Literacy University. Also this week, we hosted open houses at Woodbury Middle School and our transitions program. So I'm looking at Kelly and Christine, both of those individuals attended. When I talk about open houses, it was the open houses for the neighbors around the area. So they could come and take a look at the proposed plans, ask questions, bring up concerns. And so I do just want to go back and talk a little bit about our transitions program. There's really some inaccurate information out there about our 18 to 22-year-old students. And so I think for the board, for anybody watching, these are our students who have specialized services, who will have their school there. Currently, it's Next Step in Pathways, but these are our students, 18 to 22-year-olds. These aren't just students off the street anywhere that are going to what we're considering to be a school. So I think whatever we can do to help clarify and maybe change that reputation of what people may think in our community about our 18 to 20-year-old students. We are very proud and so excited about the site. We think it's going to be tremendous. Next week, we will host that same type of community meeting for Woodbury High School. Also, to give a couple other shout outs, April 4th, last Friday, well, it's the end of a long week, and some of us are like, just one more event. At Park High School, we hosted the multicultural event, and I would say there were 1,000 people there. Christine would probably say 500, and someone else might say 400. I don't know. But it was super packed, and I think the highlight of it was just to be able to see the various cultures of our students and see them on display. Along with just, it was almost like an indoor picnic. Food trucks outside, coming inside, watching our students perform, and a lot of work went into that, so thank you to our cultural liaisons for helping put that together. And then finally, April 5th was our Woodbury Expo. The students and families who love to stop and talk to their principals, to their old gym teacher, it's just really amazing. And so it was fun to see one of my former students who is now getting recognized for 20 years in the district, who works in our early learning department and has been there for 20 years. The connections and relationships she has with all of our early childhood family education families, all of the little kids to medium-sized kids who came up and said hello to her, it was just really a great event and so well attended. I forget what the chamber said, over 3,000 maybe people attending or more, but definitely one of the busiest expos we've ever been part of. And then finally, for any families viewing or people around the table, if you have a kindergartner, we welcome our kindergarten students into our elementary schools next week, April 17th. So that'll be their welcome to kindergarten, and we're so excited to have them.
Thank you, Julie. Do any board members have any events upcoming for any of their committees?
I do. So the SoWashCo Cares has a May Mixer coming up on May 2nd at VFW in Cottage Grove. It's 7 to 10:30 if I remember correctly, $35 a ticket. Also, they're piloting a program, Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, which offers books to kids age 0 to 5. My understanding is it's one book a month, and it's not restricted to anything, so it's just as long as you have little, you can get a book. I think the only location is St. Paul Park, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you for that information. Okay, on to 7.0, and that is our future meeting dates. April 24th, 2025 is a school board business meeting here at District Service Center at 6 p.m. Then May 8th is our school board workshop meeting here at District Service Center at 6 p.m. 8.0 is a closed session for consideration of a proposed expulsion of a student enrolled at South Washington County Schools. The board must review and discuss educational data regarding the student. The open meeting law Minnesota statute section 13D.05 subdivision 2A3 states that any portion of a meeting must be closed if educational data is discussed. We will return following the closed session to take action on the proposed expulsion. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Simi, seconded by Melinda. Any comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.